In April of 1861, American soldiers opened fire on other Americans. There was no foreign invasion, no outside enemy. The United States went to war with itself. Over the next 4 years, more than 600,000 people would die. Cities would burn, families would be torn apart, and the nation would be permanently transformed. But here's the question that still divides historians and Americans alike. Why did it happen at all? Was the Civil War inevitable? Or was it the result of decades of choices, compromises, and failures that slowly pushed the country toward collapse? This was not a sudden explosion of violence. It was the final breaking point of a long, bitter struggle over power, freedom, and the meaning of the American experiment. To understand why Americans fought each other, we have to go back long before the first shot was fired. The roots of the American Civil War stretch back to the nation's founding. When the United States declared independence in 1776, it did so while allowing slavery to continue. The contradiction was clear from the beginning. A country built on the idea that all men were created equal also held hundreds of thousands of people in bondage. Rather than resolve this conflict, the founders postponed it, hoping future generations would find a solution. By the early 19th century, the United States was moving steadily westward. New territories and states were being carved out of land taken from native nations and acquired through war and purchase. Each new state raised the same explosive question: would it allow slavery or prohibit it? Every answer threatened to upset the fragile balance of power between free states in the north and slave states in the south. Over time, two distinct societies emerged. The northern states became increasingly industrialized, with growing cities, factories, and immigrant populations. Their economy relied on wage labor and manufacturing. The southern states remained largely agricultural, dominated by plantations that depended on enslaved labor to produce cotton, tobacco, and sugar. Slavery was not a side issue in the South. It was the foundation of its economic and social order. These differences created conflicting visions of the future. Many white Southerners believed slavery was essential to their prosperity and way of life. Some defended it as a necessary evil, others as a positive good. In the North, opposition to slavery grew steadily, though it took many forms. Some wanted to abolish it everywhere. Others simply wanted to prevent its expansion into new territories. Many Northerners, even those who opposed slavery, still held deeply racist views and did not support full equality. Politics became the battlefield where these tensions played out. Compromises were repeatedly crafted to hold the Union together. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, while drawing a line across the continent to limit slavery's expansion. It bought time, but it did not solve the problem. Each compromise made the next one harder to achieve. By the 1850s, the pressure was impossible to contain. The Compromise of 1850, which included a harsh Fugitive Slave Act, enraged many in the North by forcing citizens to assist in the capture of escaped enslaved people. At the same time, Southern leaders feared that even small restrictions on slavery were the first steps toward its destruction. Violence followed the politics. In Kansas, pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers fought openly over the future of the territory, earning the name Bleeding Kansas. In Washington, a U.S. senator was beaten nearly to death on the Senate floor after delivering a speech condemning slavery. These were not isolated incidents. They were signs that the nation's political system was breaking down. This story matters because the Civil War was not simply a clash of armies. It was the collapse of a shared national identity. Americans no longer agreed on what their country stood for or whether it could exist as a single nation at all. The stage was set for a conflict that would decide the future of slavery, the power of the federal government, and the meaning of freedom in the United States. By the mid-1850s, the United States was moving steadily toward open conflict. Each attempt to calm tensions only deepened mistrust. In 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed settlers in new territories to vote on whether they would allow slavery. This policy, known as sovereign choice, overturned earlier limits on slavery's expansion. Instead of settling the issue, it ignited chaos. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas, armed and ready to fight. Towns were burned, civilians were killed, and rival governments claimed legitimacy. The violence made one thing clear: compromise was no longer working. At the same time, the national political system began to fracture. The old parties that had balanced sectional interests collapsed. In their place rose the Republican Party, founded on opposition to the expansion of slavery. Republicans did not initially call for abolition where slavery already existed, but Southern leaders viewed them as an existential threat. If slavery could not expand, many believed it would eventually die. The Supreme Court attempted to settle the issue in 1857 with the Dred Scott decision. The court ruled that African Americans could not be citizens and that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. Instead of resolving the crisis, the decision outraged the North and emboldened the South. Many Northerners concluded that the federal government was controlled by slaveholding interests. Trust in national institutions eroded even further. The conflict grew increasingly personal. Abolitionist John Brown became a symbol of the nation's moral divide. In 1859, he led a raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, hoping to spark a slave uprising. The raid failed, and Brown was captured and executed. In the North, some viewed him as a martyr willing to die for justice. In the South, he was seen as proof that abolitionists intended violent revolution. Fear spread rapidly through slaveholding communities. All of these events set the stage for the election of 1860. When Abraham Lincoln, the Republican candidate, won the presidency without carrying a single Southern state, many white Southerners believed they had lost their voice in the Union. Lincoln insisted he had no intention of abolishing slavery where it already existed, but his election symbolized a shift in power that the South could not accept. One by one, Southern states declared their secession from the United States. Beginning with South Carolina, they argued that the Union was a voluntary agreement and that states had the right to leave. By early January 1861, 11 states had formed the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as their president. They claimed they were defending states' rights, but their own declarations made clear that the protection of slavery was central to their decision. The nation now faced a fundamental question: could the United States survive as a single country? Or was it merely a collection of states bound together only as long as it was convenient? Lincoln believed secession was illegal and that allowing it would destroy the republic. Yet for months, both sides hesitated, hoping the other would blink. That hesitation ended in April 1861 at Fort Sumter, a federal military installation in Charleston Harbor. When Confederate forces opened fire on the fort, the Civil War began. What had once been political disagreement had become armed rebellion. The conflict that followed would test the nation in ways no one could have fully imagined.
The Civil War reached its turning point in the summer of 1863. By then, the conflict had already shattered any illusion of a short or limited war. Battles like Antietam, Shiloh, and Fredericksburg had produced casualties on a scale the nation had never seen. Entire towns mourned their dead. Hospitals overflowed. The war had become a grinding struggle of endurance, and both sides were searching for a decisive moment. That moment came in July at a small crossroads town in southern Pennsylvania called Gettysburg. Confederate General Robert E. Lee had led his army north, hoping to relieve pressure on the South, win foreign recognition, and perhaps force the Union to negotiate peace. For 3 days, from July 1 to July 3, 1863, Union and Confederate forces clashed in one of the bloodiest battles of the war. The fighting was brutal and relentless. Soldiers charged across open fields under heavy fire. Entire regiments were cut down in minutes. The climax of the battle came on the 3rd day, when Confederate forces launched a massive frontal assault known as Pickett's Charge. Thousands of Southern soldiers advanced across nearly a mile of exposed ground toward entrenched Union positions. The attack failed catastrophically. The Confederate Army suffered devastating losses and was forced to retreat. Almost simultaneously, Union forces achieved another critical victory at Vicksburg, Mississippi. The fall of Vicksburg gave the Union complete control of the Mississippi River, effectively cutting the Confederacy in two. These twin defeats marked the high watermark of the Confederate cause. From that point forward, the South would remain largely on the defensive. The meaning of the war also changed at this moment. Earlier in the conflict, President Lincoln had focused primarily on preserving the Union. But as the war dragged on, it became increasingly clear that the Union could not survive unchanged. In January 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people in Confederate-held territory to be free. While limited in immediate effect, it transformed the war into a fight against slavery itself. This shift carried enormous consequences. Enslaved people fled plantations in large numbers, undermining the Southern economy and war effort. Nearly 180,000 black men would eventually serve in the Union Army, fighting for a freedom that had long been denied to them. The war was no longer only about preserving a nation, it was about redefining it. Gettysburg and Vicksburg did not end the Civil War, but they changed its trajectory forever. The Confederacy could still fight, but it could no longer realistically win. The conflict had reached its emotional and historical peak. From this point on, the outcome was increasingly clear, even as the suffering continued. The Civil War did not end quickly after its turning point. For nearly 2 more years, the fighting continued with relentless intensity. Union generals like Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman adopted strategies of total war, targeting not only Confederate armies, but the economic systems that sustained them. Sherman's march through Georgia devastated railroads, farms, and cities, breaking the South's ability and will to continue the fight. By the spring of 1865, the Confederacy was exhausted. Its cities were in ruins, its economy collapsed, and its armies depleted. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered his Army of Northern Virginia to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. Other Confederate forces soon followed. The war was over. The cost was staggering. More than 600,000 soldiers died, a number greater than all other American wars combined up to that point. Millions of civilians were displaced. Entire regions were left impoverished. And just days after the war's end, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, plunging the nation into grief at the very moment it faced the challenge of rebuilding. The war's legacy reshaped the United States. Slavery was formally abolished with the 13th Amendment. The 14th and 15th Amendments redefined citizenship and voting rights, at least in principle. The federal government emerged stronger, and the idea of the United States as a single, indivisible nation was firmly established. Yet the deeper questions raised by the war did not disappear. Reconstruction brought hope and progress, but also violent resistance and eventual retreat from racial equality. Many of the political, racial, and regional tensions that fueled the Civil War would continue in new forms for generations. The Civil War matters because it forced Americans to confront the meaning of freedom, equality,
and national unity. It determined whether a democracy built on ideals could survive its own contradictions. The answers were costly, incomplete, and still debated today, but they permanently altered the course of American history. The American Civil War was more than a series of battles. It was a conflict over what the United States was and what it was willing to become. More than 150 years after its causes and consequences are still argued, still felt, and still deeply relevant. Do you think the Civil War was inevitable, or could different choices have prevented it? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you found this documentary valuable, consider liking the video and subscribing for more long-form history that explores not just what happened, but why it mattered.